Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to this army video on the mighty Skaven under Empire. I'll do the army video before I do the tactics video, so that you'll at least have a faint inkling as to what the hell I am talking about when I mention the various units. So, let's get started with the heroes of the Skaven race. And the Skaven, being the most awesome army in the Warhammer universe, of course, starts out big. While the Chaos Horde started out with something as puny as a demon prince, so the Skaven start out with their first Lord-level character being a vermin lord. Now, a vermin lord is essentially a greater demon, manifested in the same way that the Bloodthirster is manifested by Khorne. And being a greater demon, he comes with a suitably impressive stat line, with a base movement of 8, meaning that this guy is faster than most horses, and a weapon skill of 8, meaning that he's a better fighter than most elves. Add to that initiative 10, so he pretty much always attacks first in combat, a respectable amount of wounds and attacks, plus the fact that he's stronger than an ogre and often uses essentially a halberd, which gives him yet another point of strength as a bonus. And he's a level 4 wizard with access to both Skaven laws. So, the Vermin Lord sounds pretty damn good on paper, doesn't he? He's not ridiculously expensive, well, he is relatively bloody expensive, but he's not insano expensive for that stat line. He's excellent at hunting down units of monsters, for example, although you need to be a little careful about monsters out of two-handed weapons. But here's the kicker. The Vermin Lord cannot join units because Skavens are scared shitless of this creature, and with very, very good reason. And since he can't join a unit, this means that he can be targeted separately by ranged attacks. And seeing as he doesn't have any extra protection from shooting, he can turn into a pincushion real damn fast. Additionally, he is not unbreakable or stubborn, so he actually runs away. A greater demon is not going to retreat ever, but the Vermin Lord, being a manifestation of Skavendom, well, he puts his own hide far above your measly plans. But those drawbacks aside, he is still a ridiculously powerful single character that is also a level 4 wizard. I usually don't employ too many Vermin Lords in my tabletop army, but in bigger games I usually throw one in just because he's a very powerful wizard, and Skaven magic being quite potent, although ever so slightly unreliable. He's got the stat line to defend himself, and with that movement speed he is an excellent flank guard. If you have a Vermin Lord on a flank, the enemy is not going to be sending any real cavalry over there, because odds are the Vermin Lord is quick enough to catch those cavalry before they can charge the Vermin Lord, and thereby he'll absolutely just destroy them. They won't have much chance against him, unless of course it's some super heavy stuff like Blood Dragon Vampires or Chaos Knights, in which case your Vermin Lord, he could take him, but he'd be beaten up at the end. So, how is the Vermin Lord going to perform in a total war game? Well, he's a reasonable fighter, but his somewhat lacking attack is going to mean that he's going to struggle against fully ranked up units. And since he is neither unbreakable nor stubborn, odds are that a ranked up unit of infantry are probably going to see him packing. However, he'd be really damn effective against units of light infantry, for example. Skirmishers and other things that he can catch because of his ridiculous movement speed, or light cavalry. He'd also be able to deal relatively well with smaller units of elite cavalry. Additionally, he is a very good mage, and the Skaven have access to some really good mage spells, which could make him a fairly useful artillery platform, with plenty of close-in defense. I think the Vermin Lord could be an extremely flexible and interesting unit, but due to their rarity, they should also be incredibly rare. Probably they should either be some kind of top-tier temple research, like if you build a massive temple to the Horned Rat, like a tier 5 super building that requires a ton of research and an absolute insane amount of money to build, then you can start recruiting them, and even then you can only recruit like 3 of them tops, but that could work. Or you make him a unique unit gifted to you by an event. The Horn Rat looks favorably upon your designs and grants you 2 or 3 vermin lords, for example. That'd be cool. But they could also be recruitable because they're not that ridiculously powerful. They're just pretty damn powerful. Well, that's mostly it for the vermin lords, so let's move on to something a little bit more normal in Skaven terms. First up, you've got your basic general, the Warlord. For a Lord level character, he's pretty damn cheap, really. He's got a damn good stat line for Skavens, and his biggest strength is his precious leadership of 7. Now, leadership of 7 in and of itself is not that great. However, because units in tabletop can use the general's leadership when he is within a certain range, he is vital to a Skaven army, where a lot of your units have very low leadership and therefore break and run very easily. So having a good warlord with a bit of mobility in him is vital for keeping your horde actually fighting rather than running. And while he's not a real combat lord monster, he's not a slouch in melee combat, and if you kit him out properly, he can be quite potent. Now, he shouldn't be fighting other lords, because they are going to be beating the shit out of him. And I mean pretty much any lord. Empire lords, just normal humans, Bretonnian lords, slightly more powerful. Hell, even wood elf lords, which are usually known for their shooting prowess rather than their stomping into tiny squidgy pieces prowess, has a pretty good chance against a Skaven warlord. But put him in the front of a nice big unit of storm vermin or other Skaven units, and he will add precious killing power to your otherwise reasonable but not exceptional combat units. And he is one of the relatively few Skavens capable of taking a mount, so I'll touch upon that at the front of the army list rather than the back like I usually do, because, well, he's basically the only one who can do it. First up is the Rat Ogre Bonebreaker. Essentially, he's just riding a Rat Ogre. And not so useful in a mount sense because it's not that particularly fast. However, it is a rat ogre, which means it's pretty damn good at fighting. And being inside the unit, your warlord is still gaining protection from being inside a unit against shooting attacks, and you're adding a rat ogre to the unit with your warlord on top of it. If the warlord can add a little bit of combat power, well, a reasonable amount of combat power to a unit, a warlord riding a rat ogre is going to turn your normally quite flaccid little unit into an absolute murder beast. Another good option is the Skaven Warlitter, which does essentially the same job as the Bonebreaker by adding a little bit more of oomph to your melee combat power of your warlord. Though nowhere near as powerful as the Bonebreaker, it still adds a fair bit of oomph to the unit, and it is cheaper and gives him a bit more armor save. So, it's quite good. Personally, I prefer the Warlitter just because it's cheaper, and I consider the Bonebreaker to be almost a little overkill, but that's very much so a question of taste, I think. What's not a question of taste, however, is the Great Pox Rat. Being just a giant diseased rat upon which your warlord rides, for some fascinating reason, no doubt, it's not very useful. You're paying a third of your warlord's costs for 1 additional points of armor and 2 poisoned attacks. Not great at all. Like, I'd probably mount my Plague Priests on a Great Pox Rat if I cared enough. But a warlord? It's not particularly fast. I mean, look at it. It's a dying rat. It's not particularly, speedy. So it's not really a mobility mount either. I guess you could consider it a very cheap kind of mount as an alternative to the Warlitter, and it looks kind of cool if you're into that, I suppose, but I don't know. Again, in Total War, all of these things would be cool as to add a little bit of combat power to the unit, but again, the Great Pox Rat not being that great at adding combat power, could be a cool option, but not a particularly potent option. And speaking of not particularly useful, the Brood Horror. Weighing in at more than twice the cost of a Rakdos Bonebreaker, you get an absolutely tiny stat increase, very little extra armor, a few nifty special abilities, and you get to paint a giant bullseye on your warlord's face, as now he's sitting on a giant, deader, sicker, pulsating plague rat. And it's not particularly tough either. In tabletop terms, the Brood Horror is one of the most useless units in the game, sadly. But in Total War, it could be cool. Now, you're still painting a giant bullseye on one of the most important characters in your army, so I still wouldn't really recommend it. But at least in Total War, it could fulfill a role as a kind of big cavalry kind of thing that could be added to the Skaven army that don't have a whole lot of big shock units. Though again, you're risking one of the most valuable characters in your army so that you can get one more kind of okay shock unit. I'm not sold on this one either, really. So, to bring myself from the slight depression that the Brood Horror has brought over me, we'll talk about the best character in the entire game, the Grey Seer. Personally, I almost always take a Grey Seer instead of a Warlord. He's still got Leadership 7, so he can still be used to keep your cowardly little Skavens fighting rather than bitching out and running, but he's also a Wizard Lord, which gives him all kinds of wonderful spells which he can mix and match freely from the Skaven lists. And though he's considerably more expensive than the Warlord at over twice the cost, that extra magical potential is just so valuable. And with Skaven magic being as powerful as it is, the Great Seer can be one of the most valuable units in your army. You can get a lot of mileage out of this little grey bastard. And if you want to add a little bit more oomph to him, you can mount him on a Screaming Bell. Now, the Screaming Bell is something I usually avoid in smaller armies because it's a very, very random piece of hardware. And if you do mount your Grey Seer on a Screaming Bell, he's starting to creep up to Vermin Lord level of expensive at 440 points without any magical equipment. But the interesting thing is, every turn the Screaming Bell does something random, like maybe it'll cause one of your units to go berserk and attack like crazed Chaos Warriors for a turn. Maybe it will stop all of the enemy ranged units from firing as they desperately clutch their ears to try and protect themselves from the racket. Maybe buildings will start to collapse, burying enemy units under them, or, well, Skaven units, but hey, you got more Skavens than they got dudes, so net win. And many, many other interesting things. Now, in tabletop, all of these things can be done. In a Total War game, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. The whole destruction of buildings, I think, could be really cool, actually. Just seeing the enemy cities start falling apart as this thing is rolling up and stuff. Oh. It wouldn't be very useful since you'd have to be rebuilding all of it, but it'd be cool. It could also be a really interesting siege unit. Like, if you have a Screaming Bell in your army, you get to destroy one section of wall, for example, because it's really, really loud and that makes stone, go away. Okay, it's not very logical, but it'd be cool. And it could have essentially spells bound to it that are cast at random. For example, it makes one of your units go berserk, it stops an enemy ranged unit from firing, maybe it causes an enemy unit to take a leadership test, that kind of things. Be very random, which is not great in a Total War game because you don't want all that much randomness in a game like that, but if you're playing Skaven, you've probably already resigned yourself to a certain level of randomness, so I think that'd be a cool unit. Now, after hearing about the Warlord and the Grey Seer, you'd be wondering why the hell you'd ever take any other hero, and I'd agree with you, but strangely enough, the developers over at Games Workshop decided that the Skavens needed a few more options, so we get the Chieftain, which is your very basic hero, the equal of an Empire Captain, or a Champion of Chaos. He's not particularly good at fighting, although he's got a relatively good stat line, for a Skaven anyways. but he can be kitted out with some interesting equipment, and he's very, very cheap, which means he adds just that little bit of extra killing power to Skaven units, which they desperately need. And of course, if they end up doing a more complicated, more interesting and deeper character system, the chieftain would be your base level character, essentially. You'd start out as a chieftain, and then you'd push your way up the ranks, and you'd specialize into being a grey seer, or a warlord, or a warlock engineer, that kind of stuff. So he's a cool little unit, and most Skaven units should probably have a chieftain to lead them. Now, in Total War terms, if they do implement the characters like I wanted them to, the chieftain should be able to join units. Like, I would like them to do characters like that. Don't give the characters a bodyguard, allow us to just put them in units, which would mean that chieftains would be exactly what they're supposed to be. A little bit of stiffening up of the front ranks, so to say. And the Skaven being the Skaven, of course, we have the Warlock Engineer. Now, despite being an engineer, the Warlock is essentially your basic wizard. While your Grey Seer is your proper magic-wielding wizard, the Warlock Engineer is kitted out with all kinds of bizarre technology that allows him to act kind of like a wizard. For example, you can have him cast Warp Lightning, and it's a hell of a lot more effective to have your Warlock Engineers casting this rather than your Grey Seer, so you could free him up to do bigger, more interesting things. In Total War terms, the Warlock Engineer would be a ranged hero. Basically, he'd have an ability on, for example, a 2 or 3 minute timer that allows him to cast the Warp Lightning spell. And again, preferably he should be able to join units. He could be put into a unit of Warp Lightning Jezails, although that will require you to put the Jezails far too close to the enemy for comfort, because Warp Lightning has a relatively short range. And while he is not particularly great in a fight, he can defend himself, and while far more expensive than the chieftain, so not really that effective at just being another slightly more beefy combatant, his ability to take all kinds of interesting and zany gadget makes him a pretty damn good investment for most Skaven armies, and in Total War terms could give you all kinds of interesting special abilities to play around with. And, Skaven being Skaven, you not only have a pseudo-steampunky wizard, you also have assassins, which could be a really interesting thing to have your characters be doing. Now, in normal Total War games, the assassin is an agent moving around the map, you give him missions and you do stuff. But wouldn't it be really, really cool if you can have the assassin as a character path for your characters? Now, Skavens should have a ton of characters because they're quite expendable, and because Skavens do not breed in ones or twos. A Skaven can have dozens upon dozens of children, most of which are going to be eaten by their brothers and sisters, a fair few more are going to be killed in combat, and a fair few of them are probably going to be killed by their proud parents for trying to upstage them. But that aside, wouldn't it be so much cooler if you could have an assassin character? So you could still moving around the map as an agent, but you could also put him in your army, where he would essentially be a relatively good combatant, but he'd be more based around the idea of having tons of camouflage and sneaking abilities. You could put him in a unit of Skaven Gutter Runners, which are also basically assassin trainees, and you could have him be all kinds of cool in a flanking kind of way. You could have him sneak around the map, attacking war machines, assassinating enemy heroes in battle, all kinds of cool stuff. Like, how cool the assassin could be really depends on how far they want to go with the character system. If they want to make the assassins just agents, then okay, fine. Play it safe, do it the old Total War way, nothing wrong with that. But there is a potential to really do something cool with the assassin characters, especially in the Skaven army line. Now, I've been gushing enough, so let's try to move on to something I'm not as keen on, the Plague Priest. Now, the Plague Priest is the last and the least, in my opinion, of your heroes, and while some people swear to the Clan Pestilence, and I can understand why, Clan Pestilence is an interesting army list to play, but personally, they're too nurgly for me. I've never been a huge Nurgle fan, and the Plague Priest is essentially just that. He is a wizard with access to plague magic, which is a relatively potent tree, and if I take a plague priest, it's purely because he's got some awesome magic. But he also has some really interesting abilities in that he makes Clan Pestilence unit perform better in battle. And in a total war game, there is the potential for some real cool stuff with the Plague Priest. If you give the Skavens enough unit variety to model the various clans, Clan Pestilence, Clan Eshin, Clan Scryer, and their armies, you could do some really cool stuff. And a Clan Pestilence army could be a really fun change of pace from the normal Skaven army. As a normal Skaven army is quite hordy, quite fast, quite weak, the Plague Monks are slow, fairly tough, and quite dangerous. And with a Plague Priest casting Plague Magic, to which your little bastards are virtually immune, you can have some real fun with that. And it's one of those, I have to admit, kind of iconic Skaven things. For example, you can mount your Plague Priest on a Plague Furnace. This monstrous contraption is an attrition monster. It kills everything around itself, including your Plague Monks. Though Plague Monks, well, they die slow. And your enemy units, they die a lot faster. If you can get the Plague Furnace into the middle of the enemy army and start casting plague magic and all kinds of stuff, it's just beautiful. It's one of the few moments where I actually like Clan Pestilence. And in Total War terms, it could be equally cool. Like, you'd have this unit that's actually killing your own dudes, and it would be relatively weak if unsupported. You could just swamp it with units and kill it off relatively quickly before the plague really gets a chance to spread. But if you take the risk of moving this thing up with your army and take the casualties, it would be an absolute attrition monster. It would be beautiful. And it would give you some more tactical options. You don't just have to line up your army in a couple of lines and either bum rush the enemy or wait for the AI to bum rush you. You can mix and match your tactics around your clan and your composition. Something we've always kind of had the opportunity to do in Total War game, but haven't really been able to fully explore because, well, we've only been using humans. There's a limit to just how many crazy things you can do with historical humans. Well, that took a while, so that's all of the hero units for the Skavens. As I think you can see, they've got a lot of really cool stuff that could be implemented in a lot of really interesting ways in Total War Warhammer. And I really hope they do, because there's too much cool stuff here to be ignored.